Who's Morghy? Who is Morghy? And above all, what does he have to do with blockchain? Stay with me because there's an interesting story to tell, but first, subscribe to the Blockchain for Healthcare channel, the channel that tells how blockchain technology is changing health and healthcare. Hi, this is Fabio Ferentini. Welcome to a new video on blockchain for healthcare. Today something a bit different because I'm going to tell a story, and I owe this to some friends who, after watching my videos, asked me, what's with the skull wearing a wig behind you? And as I was explaining it to them, it occurred to me that it would actually be nice to make a video about it, because in fact it's about telling the story of a famous figure from Forlì. So let's go find out who it is. It all started in 2021. We were still in the COVID era, although in its declining phase, and while talking to my eldest daughter's teacher, at the time she was in 5th grade, I mentioned that that very year marked the 250th anniversary of the death of Giovanni Battista Morgagni, the famous physician from Forlì and founder of pathological anatomy, that branch of medicine, an absolutely crucial field. And so she asked me if I would like to tell the children the story of Morgagni. I gladly accepted, also because there was the added challenge that these were CLIL hours, so I would have to do it in English. CLIL refers to those subjects that are taught in another language. So I showed up to the children wearing a wig and holding a skull, and I asked them, do you recognize me? I represent a famous person from Forlì in the 18th century, to whom a square is dedicated where there is a statue depicting me. Actually, in Forlì, there isn't just a square with the statue dedicated to Morgagni. There's also the classical high school and the hospital, which is called Morgagni Pierantoni. Anyway, the mystery has been revealed. Here is Morghy, who at this point can be considered the mascot of the channel, and ideally, as you can see from the photo of the statue, is that skull held in the palm of Morgagni's left hand. Now, what remains to be understood is what Morgagni has to do with the blockchain, assuming he actually has anything to do with it at all, but this will only be revealed at the end. Well, I'd say that at this point it's time to tell the story of Giovanni Battista Morgagni, because it's a story that few people know about this incredible, extraordinary figure, the contribution he made to medicine, and also the contributions made by his teachers and the method he used, which in turn he had learned from his mentor. So make yourselves comfortable, because I'm going to tell you the story. So, Giovanni Battista Morgagni was born in Forlì in 1682 to a well-off family, although he would become fatherless just a few years later. He was 7 years old, if I recall correctly. He was an intelligent, lively, sharp, observant, and curious child. At the age of 14, he was accepted into the Accademia dei Filergiti in Forlì, where various scientific subjects were studied, as well as Latin. Then, at 16, he went to university, naturally Bologna for that era, where he studied medicine as well as philosophy, and graduated around the age of 21. In Bologna, Morgagni not only embarked upon an extraordinary and significant journey of intellectual development and profound growth, but also commenced his professional career. In Bologna, he was practically guided step by step, with meticulous care and attention, by an extraordinary individual, an exceptional and highly skilled doctor, a truly remarkable luminary, Antonio Maria Valsalva, who was also originally from the Romagna region, specifically from the Imola area, a place of considerable historical and cultural importance. Antonio Maria Valsalva is known, for example, for the sinuses of Valsalva, which are the aortic sinuses, and for the Valsalva maneuver involving the ear, which Morgagni discussed. Morgagni also wrote a biography about Valsalva. Valsalva was a great physician, a great physiologist, a highly esteemed person of his time who served as a teacher, a guide, and above all a mentor to Giovanni Battista Morgagni, teaching him the importance of using an experimental scientific method in his research. Morgagni treasured this lesson, so much so that he adopted this method and truly made it his own. So much so that it would later become known as the Morgagnian method. We will come back to this later because the topic of the Morgagnian method is crucial. In reality, the Morgagnian method is a method he learned from his teacher Antonio Maria Valsalva, who in turn had learned it from his own teacher, who, believe it or not, is also an incredible name, Marcello Malpighi of Bologna. Marcello Malpighi, the one of the corpse of the Malpighian pyramid at the renal level. Marcello Malpighi is another towering figure in the history of medicine, so just think about that trio. Malpighi, Valsalva, and Morgagni. Incredible. A sort of pantheon in the 18th century of scientists who contributed in a unique way to the development of modern medicine. Malpighi went to study, to train, and I believe also to teach for a few years in Pisa, and he was accepted as a member of the Accademia del Cimento. This is indeed a truly crucial and significant point because the Accademia del Cimento was that particular and influential academy whose primary goal was the extensive dissemination, the active propagation, and the widespread popularization of the profound thought and, above all, the innovative and rigorous experimental scientific method of none other than the immensely influential Galileo Galilei. Well, here we are in Pisa at the end of the 17th century. Galileo Galilei is not only immensely important as a scientist for his discoveries, but also for the method he passed on to us, that famous experimental scientific method. He made Dante's phrase his own, provando e riprovando, testing and retesting. Riprovando means refuting, and he truly made it his own, the importance of experimentation. This Accademia del Cimento spread Galileo's scientific method, and within the Accademia del Cimento was Marcello Malpighi. In fact, it was right there that Malpighi learned to use the microscope. You should know that it was Malpighi who introduced the use of the microscope into clinical practice, experimentation, and the medical field. So Malpighi was the first great microscopist in the history of medicine. So Malpighi, Valsalva, and finally Morgagni. It was from Malpighi that this experimental scientific method learned in Pisa was passed on through Valsalva to Morgagni. At a certain point, Morgagni had to leave Bologna. We could call it a brain drain. Why? Because Morgagni became very, very, very famous thanks to his first great treatise, the Adversaria Anatomica, which consists of 6 volumes, later accompanied by the anatomical epistles, and his major work as an anatomist, which of course was carried out on cadavers through autopsies. Morgagni always mainly performed major autopsies, and this bothered people. In fact, at a certain point, Morgagni was called His Anatomical Majesty, which was something exceptional for the time because this nickname was given to him abroad. That is, Morgagni became extremely famous throughout the entirety of Europe for his profound and meticulous research activity as a distinguished anatomist, and in fact, his truly enormous and comprehensive work, famously known as the Adversaria Anatomica, vividly shows us just how incredibly dedicated he was in his diligent work, through extensive and careful autopsies performed on numerous cadavers, to diligently searching, meticulously discovering, and precisely dissecting in order to accurately identify a vast multitude of incredibly small areas, intricate recesses, and indeed anything that had not yet been precisely identified or clearly named anatomically. In fact, Morgagni's esteemed name is truly and widely associated with many significant parts of our human body. Obviously, all this well-deserved fame created problems for him, and let's remember that Bologna was under the Papal States, so his detractors had a fairly easy time casting him in a bad light precisely because of his work with autopsies and cadavers. And so Morgagni, a truly brilliant and ambitious individual, managed to get himself called to another extremely prestigious and highly regarded university of the time, which indeed had a highly renowned and celebrated medical school by a famous and influential doctor of that particular era, Professor Vallisneri, who was prominently located in Padua. Let us remember that Morgagni lived to an incredible age for his time, because Morgagni died at 89 years old, and he spent 60 of those years in Padua. Morgagni's name is much more closely associated with the Faculty of Medicine in Padua than with that of Bologna, even though Bologna played a crucial role in his education and in the early stages of his professional development. There, in Padua, Morgagni carried out all his research, not only from an anatomical point of view, but also from a pathological one, Because let us remember, these are the two great branches of medicine on which Morgagni focused, and above all on correlating pathology with any anatomical alteration of an organ. And it was in this way that he essentially founded, from this union, pathological anatomy. And it was precisely in Padua that he carried out most of his work in his mature years. Padua was under the Republic of Venice, the Serenissima, and there was much more freedom for a scientist to work with cadavers, so to perform autopsy. In 1761, Morgagni published his masterpiece, a truly enormous treatise called De Sedibus et Causis Morborum, on anatomically investigated diseases, that is, on the locations and causes of diseases investigated through anatomy, meaning through autopsy. This truly enormous and significant volume is, in actual fact, a pivotal milestone in the entire history of medicine, and can quite rightfully be considered the definitive turning point and the very beginning of modern medical science, because it is thanks to precisely what Morgagni so meticulously wrote in this groundbreaking treatise that the entire long-standing theory of humors, which had dated all the way back to the ancient times of Hippocrates and Galen, was finally and decisively surpassed. And now we speak of organ pathology. So what does Morgagni actually do? He goes on to correlate, to demonstrate the connection between the anatomical alteration of an organ and the clinical symptoms of a disease. It is precisely here that pathological anatomy is born. Well, we started with the anecdote about Morghy, who in the meantime has become the mascot of the channel. Let's hope he doesn't fall apart on me. And we've ended up telling the story of an extraordinary doctor and scientist like Giovanni Battista Morgagni, the father of pathological anatomy. At this point, however, we need to answer the question that was asked at the beginning of the video: what does it have to do with anything? What does Giovanni Battista Morgagni have to do with blockchain? A straightforward answer: nothing. Nothing, at least directly, because obviously there can't be any direct correlations. This is pretty clear. However, there are some specific points of contact that I could even confidently call truly objective and verifiable. Let's take a look at what they are. The first point of contact between Morgagni and blockchain can be summed up with a phrase that later became a famous motto: don't trust, verify. It was said that Morgagni used an experimental scientific method and therefore an empirical approach to verify his own hypothesis. He didn't trust the medical dogmas of the time, the theories of the time, or even the symptoms themselves. He wanted to understand the reason behind those symptoms and correlate them with any anatomical alterations he found through autopsy. So he experimented, he verified. Don't trust, verify is a real motto widespread in the open source world and especially popular in the Bitcoin community. Why do I bring up Bitcoin? Because, as I've explained before, the blockchain as we know it today was born with Bitcoin. They are two sides of the same coin. Let's set aside the fact that other cryptocurrencies, other coins, and even other blockchains have come along, assuming we can even call them blockchains and not DLTs. Let's leave that aside. The blockchain as we know it today was born with Bitcoin, and even though it doesn't appear that don't trust, verify was ever written down by Satoshi Nakamoto himself, assuming of course that Satoshi is a single person and not a group of people, it's extremely consistent with the 2009 Bitcoin white paper, where thanks to the blockchain, we have an open source, peer-to-peer electronic payment system that is completely decentralized and distributed and is based on cryptographic proofs, meaning mathematics. This means it is based on something scientific, it has a scientific foundation, and is not based on trust. The second point of contact, if we want to call it that, is the overcoming of central authorities, which is somewhat a direct consequence of the don't trust, verify principle. That is, verify and do not trust, regardless of whether what you are told comes from a central authority, which might even be an institution. In the case of the blockchain, and when I talk about blockchain here, I'm always referring to public, permissionless blockchains. I always think of the Bitcoin blockchain because, as I mentioned earlier, everything started from there. So this is how we move beyond central authorities. Thank you. The concept of an intermediary, of a third party, which in the case of currency issuance is a central authority, is an institution because the system is based on cryptographic proofs and therefore on a scientific basis. As for Morgagni, he stood in opposition to the dogmas that were still present at the time, which considered diseases to be based on a sort of imbalance of the humors, a theory that dated back to Hippocrates and Galen. These were ideas and concepts, theories that were nonetheless passed down and were common knowledge among a large portion of the medical profession. Morgagni dismantled all of this thanks to the application of his experimental scientific method. Let us also remember another great scientist who went against the central authority, let's put it simply, none other than Galileo Galilei. Therefore, without venturing too far into hyperbolic and completely anachronistic comparisons, because if you think about it, you might say, come on, Morgagni and blockchain, what do they have in common? Maybe we could have used the figure of Satoshi Nakamoto to draw a comparison between personalities, but let's leave it at that. I hope it's clear that it's come across that the goal of this video was to tell the story of this extraordinary scientist from Forli, who made such an important contribution to medicine, and in my opinion, the story of Morgagni is not very well known and he deserves to be talked about much more. It all started, in fact, from a pretext, from a simple question from a friend. But what do you do with a skull wearing a wig, which I even named Morghy? Then I had some fun making a sort of intellectual speculation, let's call it that. Let's give it a grand sounding name, but it's better to keep our feet on the ground to try and find any possible points of contact, in short, between Morgagni and the blockchain. I don't know if I managed to do it, maybe not, but I enjoyed trying. And perhaps what I'm thinking of is a sort of red thread, this trade union that conceptually could be an epistemological trade union. Big word, huh? Epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge. What am I referring to? I'm referring to the fact that scientific and technological progress allows us to overcome or question dogmas or the status quo that are often imposed on us or that we accept without considering possible alternatives. In Morgagni's case, his experimental work made it possible to verify the validity of his hypotheses, breaking down those dogmas that were partly imposed and partly universally accepted by the medical community of the time. In the case of blockchain technology, we have a technology that was created by combining technologies that were in part already available, and that allows a decentralized and distributed peer-to-peer network, so we're talking about the internet, to ensure that something can be transferred from A to B and that this transfer leaves an irreversible trace and that anyone can verify that this transfer actually took place without the need for the fiduciary intermediation of a third party, whether that be an authority or an institution. That's all. So if you enjoyed what you heard, give it a like. Thank you. Thank you for making it this far. And subscribe to the Blockchain for Healthcare channel if you want to stay updated on these topics. See you next time. Goodbye.